The meeting with the African Development Bank took place in Abidjan, in a conference room overlooking the glittering towers of the Plateau Business District. Dr. Adesina, the bank's president, was a soft-spoken Nigerian economist who had spent years fighting for African-led development. President Traore, Dr. Adesina began, "Your proposal is ambitious. $800 billion for continental power infrastructure. But the technical complexity, the coordination required between 15 countries, the political risks, are exactly why it must be African-led," Ibrahim finished. Dr. Adesina, you know better than anyone that foreign-led projects create dependencies, not capabilities. I agree with your principles, Dr. Adesina said. But we must be practical. The African Development Bank cannot finance this project alone. We need partners. African partners, Ibrahim said. The Islamic Development Bank has expressed interest. The sovereign wealth funds of Nigeria and Algeria are willing to contribute. The African Union has endorsed the concept. Dr. Adesina leaned back in his chair. And the European Consortium? They have substantial resources, proven expertise. They have substantial interest in maintaining their control over #the current that flows between worlds. The sun had not yet kissed the horizon when Ibrahim Traoré felt the ancestors stirring in his bones. He stood on the balcony of his modest office in Ouagadougou, watching the city awaken beneath a canvas of orange and gold. The Harmattan winds carried whispers from the north, dust and dreams, promises and warnings. Today he would either change the destiny of West Africa or watch it slip further into the hands of those who had never understood the rhythm of this land. "Baba, the spirits are restless," his grandmother had told him in a dream 3 nights ago, her voice echoing like thunder across the Sahel. "The power they seek to control belongs to the earth, to the people. Remember who you are, child of the thunder god." Ibrahim touched the cowrie shell pendant at his throat, feeling the smooth ridges worn by generations of Traoré hands. His great-grandfather had carried it during the resistance against the French. His father had worn it when he helped negotiate Burkina Faso's independence. Now it was his turn to carry the weight of history, the burden of $800 billion, and the dreams of 400 million souls. The phone rang, cutting through the morning silence like a blade. "Allo? President Traoré speaking." "Mr. President," the voice was crisp, European, tinged with the kind of authority that came from boardrooms in Geneva and London. "This is Marcus Wellington from the African Development Consortium. We need to discuss the terms of your ambitious proposal." Ibrahim's grip tightened on the phone. "Wellington." The name tasted like copper pennies and broken promises. "Mr. Wellington. I was wondering when you would call. $800 billion is no small sum, Minister. My clients are very interested in your infrastructure vision. But we have concerns about the local management of such a project." The coded language hung between them like smoke. Local management. As if the people who had lived on this land for millennia were somehow incapable of managing their own resources. Amadou had heard this song before, the same melody that had played when the colonialists carved up Africa, when they drained the continent's wealth while leaving its people in darkness. "The management will be entirely African," Ibrahim said firmly. "From the engineers to the accountants, from the project managers to the security forces. This is not negotiable." Pause. "Then, Minister, surely you understand that a project of this magnitude requires international oversight. My clients have extensive experience in African development projects." "Your clients have extensive experience in African exploitation," Ibrahim replied, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral authority. "But those days are ending, Mr. Wellington. The current that will flow through these power lines will be controlled by African hands." He hung up before Wellington could respond, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself. Through his window, he could see the sprawling neighborhoods of Ouagadougou, the corrugated metal roofs, the bustling markets, the children walking to school with books balanced on their heads. By nightfall, half of these homes would be shrouded in darkness, their inhabitants dependent on expensive generators or flickering candles. The irony was not lost on him. West Africa sat atop some of the world's largest untapped energy reserves. Solar potential that could power half the globe, wind corridors that sang with possibility, rivers that begged to be harnessed. Yet millions of his people lived without electricity, while European corporations grew fat on exported crude oil and mineral wealth. "Monsieur le Président?" His chief of staff, Fatoumata, knocked softly on the door. "The delegation from Ghana is here. And the Nigerian president is on line too." Ibrahim straightened his military uniform, the insignia catching the morning light. Today's meetings would determine whether his vision lived or died. $800 billion to interconnect the power grids of 15 West African nations. Solar farms in the Sahel, wind turbines along the Atlantic coast, hydroelectric dams on the Niger and Senegal rivers. A continental energy network that would finally break the chains of energy poverty. But first he had to survive the wolves. The conference room at the splendid hotel was a study in contrasts. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat the African ministers, Amadou, flanked by his counterparts from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Mali. Their faces bore the weathered dignity of men who had fought colonial legacies and bureaucratic battles. Opposite them, the European delegation. Wellington and his associates, their suits expensive, their smiles predatory. "Gentlemen," Wellington began, spreading glossy brochures across the table. "The African Development Consortium has successfully completed over 200 projects across this beautiful continent. We understand the unique challenges of African infrastructure." Amadou's colleague from Nigeria, Minister Adebayo, leaned forward. "Mr. Wellington, your company's last project in Nigeria left us with a power plant that functions at 30% capacity and a debt that will take 20 years to repay. Forgive me if I question your understanding of our challenges." Wellington's smile never wavered. "Every project has its learning curve, Minister. But consider the alternative. Without international partnership, this $800 billion vision remains just that, a vision. My clients control the financing networks, the technology patents, the global supply chains. You need us?" "No," Ibrahim said quietly, and the room fell silent. "We need each other. But on equal terms." He stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Below, a woman was pounding millet in a wooden mortar, her movements rhythmic and ancient. A metaphor for everything he was trying to preserve and transform. "Mr. Wellington, let me tell you a story," Ibrahim continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a griot. "My great-great-grandfather, Bakary Traoré, was a master blacksmith. The French came to him one day admiring his work. They said, 'Bakary, we will provide you with better tools, better metal, but we must oversee your work. We understand metalworking better than you do.'" Ibrahim turned back to the table, his eyes meeting Wellington's. Bakary laughed. He said, "I have been working with fire and iron since before your grandfathers were born. I know every grain of sand in my forge, every whisper of wind that feeds my flames. You may have machines, but I have understanding." "A charming story," Wellington said, his tone patronizing. "But this is the 21st century. Modern energy infrastructure requires modern expertise. And modern exploitation requires modern excuses," snapped the president from Mali, his French accent sharp with anger. "We have heard these promises before, monsieur. Partnership that becomes dependence, loans that become chains." The tension in the room was palpable. Ibrahim could feel the weight of history pressing down on them all, the ghost of every colonial contract, every resource extraction agreement, every development project that had enriched foreigners while leaving Africans poorer. $800 billion, Wellington continued as if the African presidents hadn't spoken. The largest infrastructure project in African history. Solar installations across the Sahel, wind farms from Senegal to Nigeria, hydroelectric networks connecting the great rivers. But the financing, the technology, the project management, these require international standards. Whose standards? Ibrahim asked. The same standards that built the Berlin Conference of 1884? The same standards that carved up our continent without consulting a single African voice. Wellington's composure cracked slightly. "President Traore, I understand your historical sensitivities. But we must be practical. This project will create jobs, generate revenue, provide electricity to millions. Surely the benefits outweigh your concerns about management structure." "Management structure?" President Tinubu's voice rose. "You mean control. You mean ownership. You mean the same pattern that has drained Africa's wealth for centuries." Ibrahim raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Wellington, I will make you a counteroffer. Your consortium provides financing at fair rates, no predatory interest, no hidden fees. We provide African expertise, African management, African ownership. Technology transfer, not technology dependence. Training programs for African engineers, not imported technicians who leave when the project ends." "Impossible," Wellington said immediately. "The risk factors alone." "The risk factors," Ibrahim interrupted, "are that you cannot accept African competence. That you cannot imagine prosperity that doesn't flow through your banks and your boardrooms." The room fell silent again. Outside, the call to prayer echoed across the city, ancient and enduring. Ibrahim thought of his grandmother's words. The power they seek to control belongs to the earth, to the people. There is another way, he said finally. African financing, African technology, African management. The African Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, sovereign wealth funds from Nigeria and Algeria. Solar technology from Morocco, wind technology from South Africa. Engineering expertise from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal. Wellington laughed, but it was a harsh sound. President, you're talking about a fantasy. The technological capability, the financial infrastructure, the project management experience, it simply doesn't exist at the scale you're describing. It exists, Ibrahim said firmly. It has always existed. We built kingdoms that stretched from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. We developed mathematical systems that Europe wouldn't understand for centuries. We created trade networks that connected 3 continents. The only thing that doesn't exist is your willingness to acknowledge our capability. He walked back to his seat, his military bearing commanding the room. Mr. Wellington, your consortium is welcome to participate in this project. But as partners, not masters. Contributors, not controllers. If you cannot accept these terms, then we will proceed without you. Wellington's face had gone pale. You're making a mistake, President. $800 billion doesn't grow on trees. Without international backing, this project will fail, and you'll be responsible for disappointing 400 million people. And with international backing under your terms, Ibrahim replied, the project will succeed, but the people will remain in chains. Golden chains, perhaps, but chains nonetheless. The European delegation exchanged glances. Years of easy negotiations with compliant African officials had not prepared them for this moment. Wellington gathered his papers, his movements sharp with frustration. We'll need to discuss this with our boards, he said finally. But I warn you, President Traore, there are consequences to isolating yourself from the international community. The international community, Ibrahim said, rising to his feet along with his African colleagues, has been isolating itself from Africa for centuries. Perhaps it's time for a change. As the European delegation filed out, Ibrahim felt the weight of his ancestors' expectations. The cowrie shell at his throat seemed to pulse with warmth, as if channeling the spirits of every African who had ever stood up to external domination. Ibrahim, President Tinubu said quietly, you realize what you've just done? Wellington's consortium controls half the development financing in West Africa. They can make life very difficult for us. They already have, Ibrahim replied. For centuries. That evening, Ibrahim sat in his family compound on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, surrounded by 3 generations of Traores. His grandmother, Ye Aminata, nearly 90 years old but still sharp as a blade, held court under the baobab tree that had shaded their family for over a century. The younger children played at her feet while the adults discussed the day's events. Baba, tell us about the ancestors, 6-year-old Mariam asked, climbing onto Ibrahim's lap. Her eyes were bright with curiosity, unmarked by the cynicism that came with age. Which ancestors, little one? Ibrahim asked, adjusting her position so she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. The ones who fought the Nasseras, she said, using the local term for white foreigners. Ye Aminata says they had special powers. Ibrahim glanced at his grandmother, who smiled knowingly. They did have special powers, he said. The power of knowing who they were. The power of understanding that the land belongs to the people, not the people to the land. And what about you, Baba? Mariam asked. Do you have special powers? Before Ibrahim could answer, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Your press conference tomorrow has been cancelled. The hotel received a bomb threat. Perhaps you should reconsider your position on international partnerships. His blood ran cold, but he forced his voice to remain steady. I have the power of our ancestors' wisdom, he told Mariam, and the power of knowing that some things are worth fighting for. Ye Aminata had noticed his expression. After the children were sent to bed, she joined him on the veranda, her walking stick tapping against the concrete. They are trying to frighten you, she said without preamble. The spirits told me this would happen. Yea, I don't want to bring danger to the family, Ibrahim said, his voice heavy with concern. Maybe I should. Should what? The old woman's voice cracked like a whip. Should bow your head and let them rape our continent again? Should teach your daughter that her people are too weak to control their own destiny? She gripped his arm with surprising strength. Boy, I lived through the French occupation. I saw them take our gold, our cotton, our young men. I saw them tell us we were children who needed their guidance. And I saw what happened when brave men like your great-grandfather said, no more. But this is different. These are not colonial soldiers. These are businessmen, economists, development experts. With the same goals, she finished. To take what is ours while making us grateful for their generosity. The uniforms change, grandson. The intentions remain the same. She pointed to the cowrie shell at his throat. Your great-grandfather wore that when he helped organize the resistance. Your father wore it when he negotiated independence. Now it's your turn to wear it while you fight for economic freedom. But $800 billion, yay. The complexity, the risk. The risk is in not trying, she said firmly. The risk is in letting another generation grow up in darkness while their heritage is sold to the highest bidder. She stood, her ancient bones creaking. Tomorrow you will hold your press conference. Not at some fancy hotel that can be intimidated, but here, in the compound, under the baobab tree. Let the ancestors witness your words. Let the spirits carry your message across the continent. And if they try to stop me? Aminata's smile was fierce. Then we remind them that thunder cannot be silenced by threats. The next morning, journalists from across West Africa crowded into the Traore family compound. The international media had also arrived, their cameras focused on the unlikely setting for a press conference about an $800 billion infrastructure project. Under the spreading branches of the baobab tree, Ibrahim stood in traditional dress over his military uniform, the cowrie shell gleaming against his chest. Journalists, brothers and sisters, children of Africa, he began, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of oral tradition. Today I speak not just as a president, but as a son of this soil, a child of ancestors who understood that true power cannot be borrowed, only owned. The cameras clicked and whirred, capturing every gesture, every inflection. But Ibrahim's attention was focused on the faces in the crowd. African faces, mostly marked by hope and skepticism in equal measure. Yesterday, I met with representatives of the African Development Consortium, he continued. They offered us $800 billion to power our continent. But they also offered us the same chains our ancestors wore, polished bright and called partnership. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the diplomatic language they had expected. For too long we have been told that we cannot manage our own resources, that we lack the expertise to harness our own wealth, that we need foreign guidance to realize our own potential. These are the lies of the colonial era, dressed in the language of development. A journalist from Reuters raised her hand. President Traore, without international financing and expertise, how do you expect to complete a project of this magnitude? Ibrahim smiled, gesturing to the baobab tree above him. This tree has stood here for over 300 years. It has weathered droughts and floods, colonialism and independence, war and peace. It draws its strength not from foreign soil, but from deep roots in African earth. He pointed to the crowd. We have petroleum engineers from Nigeria, solar experts from Morocco, hydroelectric specialists from Ghana. We have banks in Cairo and Johannesburg, investment funds in Algiers and Lagos. We have universities in Dakar and Accra training the next generation of African engineers. But the scale, another journalist began. The scale is exactly why it must be African-led, Ibrahim interrupted. When you build a house, you don't hire architects who have never lived in your climate, contractors who don't understand your soil, workers who will leave when the project ends. You hire people who will live in the house they build. A journalist from the BBC pushed forward. President, there are reports that the European Consortium has withdrawn their offer after your demands for African control. Are you prepared to let this project die for the sake of pride? Pride? Ibrahim's voice rose, carrying the authority of his ancestors. Is it pride when a farmer refuses to sell his land for a pittance? Is it pride when a mother refuses to let strangers raise her children? Is it pride when a people refuse to mortgage their future for the convenience of others? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. This is not about pride. This is about dignity. This is about the right of African people to control African resources. This is about building a future where our children don't have to choose between development and dependency. A young journalist from a local radio station raised her hand. President, what is your alternative? How will you finance this project without international partners? Ibrahim had been waiting for this question. Next week, I will be meeting with the African Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, and the sovereign wealth funds of Nigeria, Algeria, and Angola. We will be announcing the African Continental Power Initiative, $800 billion of African financing for African infrastructure under African management. The crowd erupted in whispers and urgent note-taking. This was news that would reverberate across the continent and beyond. Furthermore, Ibrahim continued, we will be partnering with African technology companies, African construction firms, African engineering consultancies. Morocco's Maison will provide solar expertise. South Africa's Eskom will contribute grid management technology. Nigeria's Dangote Group will handle construction materials. And if the project fails? The BBC journalist persisted. Then we will fail on our own terms, Ibrahim replied. But we will not succeed on anyone else's. As the press conference ended, Ibrahim felt the weight of history on his shoulders. Phone calls would be made, pressure would be applied, consequences would follow. But for the first time in months, he felt the ancestors' approval flowing through him like an electric current. The retaliation came swiftly and from multiple directions. Within hours of the press conference, Ibrahim's phone was ringing with calls from European ambassadors, World Bank officials and IMF representatives. The language was diplomatic but the message was clear. There would be consequences for defying the established order. President Traore, the French ambassador's voice was ice-cold. Paris is very disappointed with your statements today. We have been partners with Burkina Faso for over 60 years. This nationalist rhetoric is not helpful for continued cooperation. Monsieur l'ambassadeur, Ibrahim replied, his French perfect but his tone unyielding. France has been a partner in extracting Burkina Faso's resources for 60 years. Perhaps it's time for a different kind of partnership. The ambassador's response was swift. I should remind you that France provides significant aid to your country. Aid that could be redirected if relations deteriorate. Then redirect it, Ibrahim said simply. We will survive without aid that comes with chains attached. But the real pressure came from international financial institutions. The IMF representative was more direct. President Traore, the voice was crisp and businesslike. The International Monetary Fund has concerns about your government's fiscal responsibility. An $800 billion project without international oversight raises serious questions about debt sustainability. Our debt sustainability, Ibrahim replied, has been questionable for decades under international oversight. Perhaps it's time to try African oversight. President, you're playing with fire, the IMF official continued. Do you understand the economic consequences if international lending dries up? If investment stops flowing? If trade agreements are reconsidered? I understand the consequences of 60 years of international lending, Ibrahim replied. Perhaps it's time to try self-reliance. The threats were not limited to economics. A meeting was called at the presidential palace that evening, and the conversation was heated with his own cabinet. Monsieur le Président, you're playing with fire, his foreign minister said, pacing behind his desk. Do you know how many diplomatic cables I've received today? The French, the Americans, the Germans, the British, they're all concerned about your aggressive posture. Minister, they're concerned about losing control of our resources, Ibrahim replied. There's a difference. And what about the economic consequences? If we're cut off from international markets, if development funding is withdrawn, if investment dries up, who will suffer? The people you claim to be protecting. Ibrahim stood, his voice taking on the authority of his ancestors. Minister, our people have been suffering for centuries while foreigners grew rich from our resources. Perhaps it's time to try a different approach. But $800 billion, Monsieur le Président? The risk is in not trying, Ibrahim said, echoing his grandmother's words. The risk is in teaching another generation that they are not capable of managing their own destiny. The foreign minister sank into his chair. And if you're wrong? If the project fails, if we end up deeper in debt, if the people blame us for their continued poverty? Then we will have failed while trying to succeed, Ibrahim replied. Rather than succeeding while trying to fail. The minister stared at him for a long moment. You sound like Thomas Sankara, he said finally. He had the same stubborn streak, the same unwillingness to compromise. And he showed us what was possible, Ibrahim said. Perhaps stubborn is what we need. The meeting with the African Development Bank took place in Abidjan, in a conference room overlooking the glittering towers of the Plateau Business District. Dr. Adesina, the bank's president, was a soft-spoken Nigerian economist who had spent years fighting for African-led development. President Traore, Dr. Adesina began, your proposal is ambitious. $800 billion for continental power infrastructure. But the technical complexity, the coordination required between 15 countries, the political risks, are exactly why it must be African-led, Ibrahim finished. Dr. Adesina, You know better than anyone that foreign-led projects create dependencies, not capabilities. I agree with your principles, Dr. Adesina said. But we must be practical. The African Development Bank cannot finance this project alone. We need partners. African partners? Ibrahim said. The Islamic Development Bank has expressed interest. The sovereign wealth funds of Nigeria and Algeria are willing to contribute. The African Union has endorsed the concept. Dr. Adesina leaned back in his chair. And the European Consortium? They have substantial resources, proven expertise. They have substantial interests in maintaining their control over African resources, Ibrahim interrupted. Dr. Adesina, let me ask you something. When the Chinese built their high-speed rail network, did they hire foreign consultants to manage it? When the Americans developed their interstate highway system, did they insist on international oversight? Those are different situations. Are they? Ibrahim challenged. Or are they examples of nations that understood that infrastructure is sovereignty, that control of energy is control of destiny? Dr. Adesina was quiet for a long moment. President, I've spent my career trying to build African capacity, to create African solutions to African problems. But the scale of what you're proposing is exactly the scale we need, Ibrahim said. Dr. Adesina, half the continent lives without electricity. We sit on some of the world's largest energy reserves while our people burn wood and kerosene. We export oil and gas while our hospitals operate by candlelight. When will the scale be right for African solutions? And if the project fails? Then we will have failed while trying to succeed, Ibrahim said. But if we don't try, we will have succeeded in failing. Dr. Adesina smiled for the first time. You have Thomas Sankara's tongue, he said. Same passion, same refusal to accept limitations. He's the one who taught us that the ancestors' wisdom flows through those who refuse to accept that they are powerless, Ibrahim said. Very well, Dr. Adesina said, extending his hand. The African Development Bank will lead the financing consortium. But we do this right, President. African expertise, African management, African ownership. No compromises. No compromises, Ibrahim agreed, shaking the offered hand. 6 months later, Ibrahim stood on a platform in the middle of the Sahel, watching the installation of the first solar panels in what would become the largest solar farm in Africa. The panels stretched to the horizon, their black surfaces drinking in the fierce desert sun. African engineers directed African workers, their voices carrying across the landscape in a dozen languages. Baba, look how they shine. Mariam exclaimed, pointing to the panels. At 7 years old, she had become fascinated with the project, drawing pictures of solar panels and wind turbines in her school notebooks. They shine with the light of our ancestors, Ibrahim said, lifting her onto his shoulders. And with the hope of our children. The project was moving faster than anyone had dared hope. The African Continental Power Initiative had secured financing from 15 African institutions, technology from 12 African companies, and personnel from every corner of the continent. The first phase, solar installations in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, was ahead of schedule and under budget. But the real victory was not in the panels or the turbines. It was in the transformation of how Africans saw themselves. Engineering students from Cairo to Cape Town were clamoring to join the project. African companies were developing new technologies, new capabilities, new confidence. The continent was beginning to believe in its own power. President Traore, a voice called out. Ibrahim turned to see Marcus Wellington approaching, his expensive suit incongruous against the desert landscape. He had aged visibly in the past months, his face lined with stress and frustration. Mr. Wellington, Ibrahim said calmly. I heard you were in the region. I wanted to see for myself, Wellington said, his voice tight. The project my consortium could have managed. Could have participated in, Ibrahim corrected. As partners, not masters. Wellington looked out over the solar installation, his expression unreadable. I have to admit, President, you've surprised us all. The financing, the technical execution, the coordination, it's impressive. It's African, Ibrahim said simply. Yes, Wellington said, and for the first time, there was no condescension in his voice. It is. He turned back to Ibrahim. My consortium is prepared to make a new offer. Real partnership this time. Technology sharing, joint ventures, mutual respect. Ibrahim considered this. Under African leadership? Under African leadership, Wellington confirmed. With African ownership? With African ownership. And African control of the profits? Wellington hesitated, then nodded. And African control of the profits. Ibrahim extended his hand. Then welcome to the African Continental Power Initiative, Mr. Wellington. As partners. 1 year later, the lights came on in Ouagadougou. Not the flickering, unreliable electricity of the old grid, but the steady, powerful current of the new African network. Ibrahim stood in his grandmother's compound, watching as she flipped the switch that illuminated the baobab tree for the first time in its 300-year existence. "Yea, the ancestors are smiling," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No, grandson," she replied, her weathered face glowing in the electric light. "The ancestors are dancing." The African Continental Power Initiative had exceeded every projection. 200 million people had gained access to electricity. African companies had developed new technologies that were being exported to other continents. Universities across Africa were establishing energy programs that attracted students from around the world. But the real transformation was deeper than megawatts and solar panels. It was in the eyes of African children who no longer studied by candlelight. It was in the voices of African engineers who spoke with the confidence of expertise. It was in the walk of African leaders who no longer apologized for their ambitions. "Baba, tell me again about the ancestors," Miriam said, curling up next to him under the illuminated baobab tree. "Which story, little one?" Ibrahim asked, though he knew which one she wanted. "The one about the power that belongs to the people," she said. "The one about the current that flows between worlds." Ibrahim smiled, feeling the cowrie shell warm against his chest. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice taking on the rhythm of the griots, "there was a people who forgot they were powerful. They let others tell them they were too weak to control their own destiny, too ignorant to manage their own resources, too poor to afford their own dreams. But they weren't really weak, were they, Baba?" Miriam asked, playing her part in the familiar story. "No, little one. They were never weak. They had simply forgotten how to see their own strength. But then the ancestors whispered to them, reminding them that the power they sought had always been theirs. The power of the earth, the power of the wind, the power of the sun. And most importantly, the power of believing in themselves." "And what happened then?" "Then they remembered," Ibrahim said, his voice carrying across the compound to where 3 generations of Traores sat listening. "They remembered that they were the children of kingdoms and empires, the descendants of builders and scholars, the heirs of a continent that had always known how to harness the forces of nature. And they built the great network," Miriam continued, "that carried power from the desert to the sea, from the mountains to the valleys, from the cities to the villages." "Yes," Ibrahim said. "And in doing so, they discovered that the greatest power of all was not in the electricity that flowed through their cables, but in the knowledge that they could shape their own destiny." The lights of Ouagadougou twinkled in the distance, powered by African sun and African wind and African determination. Somewhere in the darkness, a new generation of African children was falling asleep to the hum of their own power grid, dreaming dreams that no one would ever tell them were impossible. And in the baobab tree above them, the ancestors danced with the spirits of all those yet to come, celebrating the current that flows between worlds, the unbreakable connection between what was, what is, and what will be. The $800 billion project had become more than infrastructure. It had become a declaration of independence, a proof of capability, a bridge between the Africa of ancient wisdom and the Africa of limitless possibility. And under the electric stars of a continent finally free to power itself, Ibrahim Traoré touched the cowrie shell at his throat and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the ancestors who had never stopped believing in the power of their people. The current flowed. The lights shone. And Africa was finally truly free.